Next up, we have Diego Oppenheimer and HP Bunaes. Diego Oppenheimer is the co-founder and CEO of Algorithmia. Previously, he designed, managed, and shipped some of Microsoft's most used data analysis products, including Excel, Power Pivot, SQL Server, and Power BI. He holds a bachelor's degree in information systems and a master's degree in business intelligence and data analytics from Carnegie Mellon University. HP Bunaes has 30 years of experience in data and analytics in the banking industry. He is the former chief data officer of SunTrust Banks. HP held a senior executive position at Fleet Boston, now Bank of America, and also led the financial services industry vertical at DataRobot, the leader in automated machine learning. HP recently founded AI-powered banking to help banks and fintechs with data and analytics strategies. HP is a graduate of MIT, where he earned an MS in Information Technology, and of Trinity College, where he earned a BS in Computer Science and Mechanical Engineering. Please join me in welcoming them both to our stage.
Thanks for having us today. Really excited to be chatting with you and to be joined by HP. So let me just get my share here real quick. What you're at today is what risk managers need to know about AI and governance. I'm particularly excited to have HP joining me, who's an absolute expert in the space. So HP, why don't I let you introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. Thank you, Diego. HP Bunaes, 30-year veteran of banking, all of it in data and analytics. For the last few years, I've been focused on AI and machine learning, applications of that technology in financial services, as well as best practices around governance and management of advanced analytics.
Great. And my name is Diego Oppenheimer. I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Algorithmia. And Algorithmia focuses on a software platform for deploying, running, serving, managing models at scale. And governance is very close to our heart. So excited to be talking about this today. So one of the things to start covering is, one of the things that we saw, we do a survey every year. And in our 2021 survey of over 400 AI and ML professionals, we really saw one thing, which is even though there's a lot more models being deployed, there's a lot more machine learning workloads being interacted with, it's actually increasing year over year the time it's taking to deploy. In a lot of cases, one of the reasons for this is because a lot of these workloads are being regulated. They need to be understood. They're being used to operationalize important parts, especially in banking, as HP's expertise. And we wanted to kind of dive a little bit into what are some of the causes and why this phenomenon is happening. We're doing a lot more with AI and ML, yet it's taking us longer and longer to actually kind of deploy around this. And so one of the things that HP and I had to talk about is really the rise of the citizen data scientist. So HP, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what you've been observing in the last couple of months and years, really.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to watch. The technology has come so far just in the last few years that people who are subject matter experts in the data, but that aren't trained in data science, can actually build some pretty sophisticated models. And what we're starting to see, I think, is that data science is breaking out of the lab, if you will, into the field, and we're seeing more and more data experts embedded in the businesses and the functions starting to build models using AutoML tools. And a lot of companies are embracing this, really supporting kind of the prototyping, at least, of models in the businesses, with a more of a formal oversight in the formal data science community. But this I think is a trend that we're going to see accelerating.
Great. And so with this trend, this sounds exciting. This sounds like there's real use and ROI happening. Really clean. Obviously, it's the subject of today's talk, but why do risk managers need to care? Why should they pay attention to this trend?
Yeah, so the tools are really, really powerful. DataRobot, which I happen to be very familiar with, is so easy to use that, my daughter could sit down and build a deep neural network with DataRobot. And that kind of power has incredible implications, both in terms of the application and the insights that you can get out of your data, but it also has some dangers. You need to make sure that people are using the right data in the right way and using the results of the models in an appropriate fashion, and that mistakes haven't been made in the way that the models have been built or the data has been prepared or the assumptions that have been made. You could open yourself up to some pretty significant risk if you just sort of let these things go, unchecked, and kind of let anybody do anything with any tool and any data any way they want, without any sort of oversight.
So we're getting to that point, and this is actually perfect segue. Where really the amount of models that are being worked on, the power of the tooling, either be AutoML tools, either it be different open source tooling or different data science workbenches, the power of those tools is actually making so that this is happening in so many places across the organization that it's kind of like a shake to the system, where the chief risk officer needs to be like, okay, we need to actually get a grasp of everything that's going on here, because we're introducing risk into the system that could be pretty significant, and it's time to wake up. Is that a good way of summarizing it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think if you go to the next slide, the pace at which the citizen data science community is growing and the use of AutoML is growing is really staggering. In 2017, Gartner said that predicted that by 2019, the number of models produced by citizen data scientists would exceed the number of models produced by the formal data science community. And since 2019, it is just accelerated. And I think that gap now between what citizen data scientists are producing and what the formal data science community is producing is wide, and that is just going to diverge, in my opinion, exponentially. So, chief risk officers sort of left, with a difficult set of decisions. Do they try to constrain the growth or the pace of innovation, or do they add more and more resources to the model risk space to be able to make sure that everything is checked, and built appropriately and using the appropriate data in the right ways, et cetera. But it's rapidly reaching a breaking point where, this doing things the same old way is no longer going to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because I talk to a lot of people and say, hey, you know what, we have a pretty good grasp of where our data is and what our model is and what the production is, and we've kind of put in this repetitive process that we think we understand, and we kind of like, hey, we've been able to deploy a model, we get predictions up and running. What's the problem? Why are you saying that this is something that we need to wake up to and look at the global who called what, when, with what data, and why? And I think I really like this visualization, which is, this is one place in your organization, but what happens when you actually multiply this? You actually have a data first organization that is actually building multiple different chains and pipelines of data model predictions. They're exploding across the organization. Like, this is what the problem that you're talking about is, right? Like, how do we actually get grasp of this landscape, not this landscape?
Exactly. And the problem is, with lots of overlapping, potentially redundant, maybe inconsistent data flows, and chains of models, models feeding models, you start to get hidden interdependencies, and change management becomes really difficult, because even a subtle change in data, or one piece of data or one model upstream could have dramatic results downstream, and it can be, practically unpredictable.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is very much in line with what we saw actually in the data of the survey come out, which is when we talk to the different organizations and what they're doing, 56% of organizations say they struggle with governance, security, and auditability issues. And this is really that multiplying or that exponential effect that you're describing, which is, hey, there's now organizations that are looking at this and saying, look, we have grasp of maybe one pipeline or what we're doing in one place or another. But when we start looking at it, what is the number one thing stopping us from actually being able to do this industrialized ML at scale is really that IT governance, security, auditability requirements. I like to call it the who called what, when, with what data, and why of the organization. And this actually came up, really bubbled up into organizations. This is what they look at right now. And you see IT organizations or the office of the CIO who are actually partnering with the risk office and saying, okay, how are we actually going to go deal with this? This isn't a question of turning off this goodness that the citizen data scientists and the machine learning is happening. It's really about, hey, how do we actually industrialize that aspect inside the organization, right?
Exactly. You don't want to slow it down. You want to accelerate.
Yeah, and that acceleration, can happen with putting together the right frameworks, the right understanding, the right repeatability. I mean, there's examples of how we've done this in traditional analytics. There's examples of how we've done this in pure software with DevOps, right? Working on security, scale, speed, of which becomes extremely important. So, one of the things that we started actually talking around as well as part of the survey is that governance really needs to be part of the day-to-day ML operations. It's not an afterthought. It's almost like we have to start with the end result. What are we going to be working with? What are we going to be complying with? And almost all the organizations that we talk to are actually dealing with multiple regulations. I mean, I know this is a very near and dear to your heart in terms of especially in financial services, the regulations. How do chief risk officers need to, they have things in place for complying with some of these regulations. How should they think about bringing the world of machine learning and data science into those, into being able to comply here? How should they frame in their mind of hey, how do we approach this industrialization so that we can actually comply with these regulations?
Yeah, great question. The problem is that they have some of the pieces and parts, but they're in a lot of cases they're disconnected, and there's some parts that just aren't there, and there's others that the tooling just isn't there to be able to enable them to do it effectively and efficiently. So you really have to rethink not only the process, but what is sort of the organizational model to support it, and then what are the right tools and monitoring capabilities in place to ensure that everything's working properly.
So when we start thinking about the challenges and risks of of ML governance, one of the things I like to kind of break it down is we see, okay, some of the best practices are unclear. It's a new space. We're trying to understand what old best practices can adopt, what new ones need to be need to put in place. The regulatory landscape is really evolving very quickly, and so it's that's another aspect of it that just keeping tabs of that becomes a process on its own. We talked a little bit about that replication. A lot of the solutions today are manual or incomplete from a data perspective, and so I have a question for you on this. Is why do you think some of these, it's so manual and incomplete? Is it just organizations are not thinking about it from an industrialized aspect of how to do it at scale? What do you think some of the the leading to these very manual and incomplete? Is it the unknowns? What's your thought there?
Yeah, a couple things. Number one, a lot of companies have really focused their model of risk management on what happens prior to the implementation of a model. Making sure that there's appropriate testing and validation, and there was out of sample data used, the appropriate data quality, all that sort of thing. But they haven't put nearly as much focus on what happens after the models have been implemented. Second, there may be some pretty significant technical debt. And what I mean by that is, legacy models built over the last, decades, right? In anything from SQL to SAS to Excel, right? I've talked to bankers who have sort of stumbled across models that nobody knew was there. Never mind knew how they worked or who developed them or knew what they did. And third, I don't think most organizations really have a complete inventory of what all their models are. So change management becomes really hard, right? If you don't know all your models and all the data that they're using, and what results they're producing, and where they're going and who's consuming them, change management becomes sort of hit and miss, right? In some cases, maybe you have a good handle on what could be impacted, but in some cases, you're just guessing. And a lot of the banks I've talked to have said, yeah, well, we track, the models on a spreadsheet, and we try to, make sure that as things change, we identify what's could potentially be impacted. But in a lot of cases, the data change management sits under one side of the organization, and the model risk, management sits under a different part of the organization, and the analytics people sit under a different part of the organization. And getting them all, talking to each other and coordinating closely around, changes that, some people may look at and say, well, this is no big deal. Really, there's no reason to go and, grab these other folks and involve them. It'll make, and it's just not a good process. I don't know, quite frankly, I don't know anybody who's doing this really well right now.
Yeah, yeah, and I think it's interesting. So especially given that we're talking to risk officers, one of the things that I always found, you put it in kind of the three categories. There's of risk. There's operational risk, there's reputational risk, and then there's the strategic risk of not doing anything. And it's really a balancing act. And it almost feels like that balancing act has been become even harder with all these machine learning models going into production, and all the goodness that this brings. That balancing act has been kind of become even harder. So maybe kind of high level, what are if we break it down into those three categories of operational, operational, reputational, and strategic risk, like what's your general recommendation to risk officers on how to frame this in their head?
Yeah, let me start with the last one, the strategic risk. So, I've talked to some companies who literally said the words, well, we're not going to allow people outside of our data science community from developing models, right? That's how we're going to control it. And I say, okay, well, you've now minimized operational risk, but you're at the cost of a gargantuan strategic risk, because your competitor may be speeding out ahead of you, and all the research indicates that the companies that get a lead in AI and machine learning are going to have an almost insurmountable advantage over the ones that don't. So you may be managing one risk really well, but at the cost of another. And reputational risk is one of those that are, it's sort of it's hard to get at, sort of on a piecemeal basis. You gotta have policies in place over, who's going to have access to what data can be used for predictive analytics, who needs to provide independent oversight over the appropriate use of data. None of these things can be looked at in isolation. And, I would suggest that companies that try to, really, really manage one may find that, they've got some serious exposure, in another. This is something that really has to be tackled holistically.
Absolutely. And so when we start thinking about all the use cases, so it's pretty clear on the risk side that there's pretty obvious ones, right? Hey, here we're using a model to do a loan, or we're actually calculating how our exposure is in equities. Like there are some kind of more obvious ones, but the reality here is that these use cases are really growing across the board. Everything from customer experience, fraud, automation of processes. Each one of these has the ability to be enhanced through machine learning, and each one of them kind of carries their own level of risk, right? In some cases, you just don't care, or maybe
Right.
don't care is a little bit of an overstatement, but the risk is minimal, and you're willing to get. But in other cases, the exposure to risk is so high. So the other framework around this is really thinking the use cases each carry their own level of risk.
Exactly
and
right.
and how does an organization approach categorizing those, right? Like how, and using the tooling, because, they want to apply data science to everything. How do they break that down in terms of, what are the places where extra regulation, extra workflows are necessary, other places we can be a little bit looser? Any kind of recommendations you have there?
That's a great question. I guess my number one recommendation would be is do not try to use a one size fits all governance framework. I could name one very large bank in the United States that is doing exactly that. They have a one size all framework. Every model goes through exactly the same process, and it's crazy. It takes a little more sophistication to do this right. There's one bank in Australia that I worked with that actually has a 7-tier framework, gradient framework, and that's maybe that's too much for some organizations, but I think it's getting to the right point, which is models that have very, very little risk, maybe should have minimal oversight, or maybe you leave that oversight up to the business units. Whereas those that are really, really risky, right, because it's externally disclosed or something that a client might see, or it's, has regulatory implications, those should get uber, right, oversight. And, there's all sorts of those that are going to sit in the middle, right? And, the first thing I'd say is put the right governance on the right model, right? Don't put too much on some and not enough on others.
Absolutely, and I think that's that's a perfect segue to close out today, which is around some of the important things to do here are really understand every model that's being created and inventoried and catalog them, be able to log all the changes that are happening to those, actually apply a risk-based model governance, exactly what you said. Really focus on creating a deployment highway. So we want speed here, but we want controlled speed. I like to say it's like it's a high-speed highway, but there's a toll booth and state patrol on it. Really give the IT organization the tools they need to monitor and operationalize these models. Get model developers out of that governance aspect of it. Really build the instrumentation around it, and really help do all the audit and explainability. And so if you can actually put these things in place through tooling and processes and people, you have a pretty good chance of actually accelerating into this world of AI ML with the proper risk and governance aspects of it.
Yeah, and I would say the number one thing is that complete inventory of the models and all the metadata about those models. You can't manage what you can't see. If you don't have that in place, then everything else is a lot harder.
Well, great. Well, thank you everybody for your time today. We're up here. Please go read the report around what risk managers need to know about AI governance. Thank you so much, HP, for joining me today. Always a pleasure, and we look forward to chatting with everybody in the future about this.
Thank you.